In 1915, the small city of San Diego hosted a World's Fair to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal. It built its own Central Park, welcomed millions of tourists, and made a name for itself as a prominent city on the western coast. There was just one problem. The exposition was unauthorized, didn't have federal support, and ran at the same time as another World's Fair, that of colossal San Francisco. San Francisco also brought in millions of tourists, reinforced itself as a primary city on the western coast, and built an enormous city park from scratch. It was filled with decadent Greek columns and statues and fountains, but when the fair was over, they destroyed it. The year these expositions took place in was a weird one for the United States. On the one hand, 1915 was the culmination of a century of westward expansion and industrial growth, now capped off by the Panama Canal, a feat of engineering that finally joined the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and fulfilled America's manifest destiny. On the other, the year was the first entirely engulfed by World War I, the war that put into question all the optimistic visions of the previous century. In this year of change, the last World's Fairs of the Victorian Age would commence, highlighting all of the contradictions, hopes, and fears of that bizarre century. First and foremost, for anyone unaware, what were World's Fairs? World's Fairs, also called International Expositions, were enormous, multi-month-long events that cities held throughout the 19th and 20th centuries to show off advancements in technology or society, and also a lot of race science. For example, San Francisco's exposition displayed a pop-up Ford Model T factory that produced 18 cars per day. Expositions were often held to celebrate important events. The famous World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago celebrated the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of the New World. So how did California end up hosting two simultaneous international expositions? Because that is not how it's supposed to happen. Well, in 1909, the president of the San Diego Chamber of Commerce proposed the idea of the city hosting a World's Fair in 1915. This was remarkable because San Diego was the smallest city to ever attempt one of these. It had a population of about 40,000. For comparison, San Francisco had about 10 times that. But the Chamber of Commerce argued that San Diego would be the first port for ships coming up from the canal, so increasing its international recognition would boost its economy in the long run. A few months later, on September 3rd, the city formed the Panama California Exposition Company. They decided to hold the exposition on the city's sprawling city park, but that name didn't suit their grand ambitions, so they renamed it Balboa Park, in honor of Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the first European to see the Pacific Ocean, fitting for a celebration of the Panama Canal. That same day in September, San Francisco announced their intention of hosting the World's Fair, in stark opposition to San Diego's plans. But let's take a break from the drama for a minute and talk about these events. One of the most interesting things about San Diego's event, which was called the Panama California Exposition, is its use of mission revival architecture. Most World's Fairs used Beaux Art style, which emphasized classical Greek and Roman elements like columns and stuff. The San Francisco Exposition, which was called the Panama Pacific International Exposition, is a perfect example of this. The buildings were covered in gaudy columns and domes, and countless Greek-style nude statues were built all over the fairgrounds. It's a style Victorians loved, and it fits into the broader themes of people being nostalgic for Greek and Roman antiquity. San Diego, meanwhile, tried to create memories of a pre-American California. It was part of a broader movement that romanticized the Mexican rancheros and the missions, early Spanish settlements that systematically enslaved and converted Native Americans to Catholicism. They villainized the early American pioneers, and by extension themselves, for killing the native populations and stealing land from the rancheros. The myth portrayed the pre-American Southwest as if it was in a blissful state of harmony on the region's sprawling pastures before violent, complicated civilization was brought in. All over Balboa Park, you can see statues of conquistadors and prevalent Catholic imagery like mission converts and monks. All of this was great for the San Diego brand, and the organizers knew that. This whole thing was planned out to market the city to middle-class Americans from the East Coast. I, for one, didn't know Balboa Park was built 100 years ago. I thought it was as old as it pretended to be, and it gave it a more fantastical image. Now that we have a general idea of these expositions, let's get back into the story. After announcing their intention to hold the World's Fair, San Francisco didn't waste any time pushing out the competition. In January 1910, at a meeting in Los Angeles, they told San Diego to drop their bid. A month later, on February 24th, San Diego's John Spreckles donated $100,000 to his city's exposition, around $3 million today. The city was doubling down. Eventually, the total rose to $1 million, which is, math noise, what is it even? Which is over $27 million today. But the next month, in April, both cities would gain a common enemy as New Orleans joined the race. And it was looking like they might get it. The federal government really didn't want to put up with California's bullshit anymore. To counter this, San Diego agreed to support San Francisco's bid only if they would be allowed to hold a smaller, explicitly secondary one themselves. In fact, one of the clauses was that San Diego had to leave the word international out of their names. This is why the ads show it in parentheses. San Francisco won the bid, and San Diego's interesting arrangement didn't go as well as they had hoped. On August 9, 1910, the United States Congress invited foreign nations to participate only in the San Francisco Exposition by sending representatives and donating exhibits. In May of the next year, Colonel, not a real colonel, David Charlie Collier persuaded the House of Representatives to ask Republican President William Howard Taft to invite some Latin American countries to participate in the San Diego Exposition as well. But it would turn out that these efforts wouldn't matter, because in January 1912, the Senate refused to recognize San Diego's exposition. This was because influential San Franciscans promised to support Congress and President Taft in their coming re-election campaign only if they denied San Diego's legitimacy. Taft and the other Republicans were worried California would fall to Teddy Roosevelt, who had just left the Republicans and formed the progressive Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt would end up winning the state by 174 votes anyway, but Democrat with a God complex Woodrow Wilson would win the presidency. San Diego kept preparing their exposition during the remainder of Taft's administration. Wilson's administration was more accommodating and approved a bill allowing foreign exhibits at San Diego. This event marked the end of most of the drama. San Diego was comfortable playing second fiddle to the big show, and San Francisco was happy to be the site of the big show. Now that the background is set, we can dive into the weirdness of these World's Fairs. International expositions were a place where people celebrated nationalism, technology, and historical symbolism. The groundbreaking ceremony in San Diego began with a triple quartet singing Exposition Ode. The president pressed a button in his office in D.C. that instantly unfurled a flag in San Diego, while the band played Hail Columbia. Attendants also unfurled flags of the various Latin American countries in attendance and played their national themes. Later, a man named Morley Staton, dressed as King Cabrillo, after the Spanish explorer of the same name, arrived at the Santa Fe Wharf on a caravel with a fleet of decorated boats and the shooting of skyrockets. Officials escorted him to the county courthouse where the newly crowned Queen Ramona, really Helene Richards, was waiting for him. The royal couple enjoyed shows featuring Asian dancers, Mexican rebels, and a bunch of other stuff. Apparently, the marriage of Cabrillo and Ramona represented the fusion of the white and Indian races. They also acted out historical scenes, like Balboa granting the Pacific Ocean to the Spanish king, Aztec priests sacrificing to the god of war, and the downfall of Aztec king Montezuma to the conquistador Hernan Cortez. How was anyone meant to understand these guys LARPing without a history lesson beforehand? It is not clear. This groundbreaking ceremony showed off some of the specific quirks about San Diego's exposition. San Francisco's was much more typical of expositions in general. While San Diego was crafting a narrative about the Spanish history of California, San Francisco was crafting a narrative about the Victorian Age in general. At the start of the video, I made a big deal about how San Francisco destroyed its elaborate exposition buildings after the fair ended. While that is true, it wasn't anything remarkable. In fact, San Diego keeping any of its exposition buildings was the outlier. The only other notable remnant from an exposition is the Eiffel Tower. It was normal for cities to build artificial cities, made basically out of paper mache. The buildings were built on wood frames and covered with mock materials. They were not meant to last. Cities undertook these massive, wasteful constructions to hide the truth about themselves. Real industrial cities during this time period were polluted, impoverished, and neglected. Not the kind of place wealthy exposition goers would want to be, so they hid their imperfections. For example, for the first half of 1912, San Diego's labor activists were attempting to unionize unskilled workers. Vigilantes engaged in street violence against them, with the help of the police department and editorials in John D. Spreckels' own newspapers. The police deported free speech activists and arrested 138 prostitutes in an attempt to clean up the city. Exposition companies didn't want the darker realities of their cities to ruin their perfect little worlds, so they built enormous walled fairgrounds that would hide reality and allow attendees to experience a fantasy. The San Francisco Exposition even had artificial sunsets that made it look like some dream city of the Arabian Nights. Much like the artificial cities they took place in, international expositions were a way for those in power, mainly governments and industrialists, to sell the systems of imperialism and economic expansion to the people. Well, really to sell it to wealthy people. They didn't care much what everyone else thought. They wanted wealthy Westerners to look past the arguments of the progressives that the world they were living in was immoral. They covered up the flaws of their system and amplified its successes. They created massive displays of technological improvements, palaces of industry, where you could see the workings of the Panama Canal or the genius of Henry Ford's assembly line. They showcased the benefits of race science, where you could see how we could create a superior race through personal and public hygiene. Europeans were glamorized through the romanticization of the ancient Greeks and Romans. The exposition made heavy use of Greek-style nude statues. The large figures of muscular Greek gods were meant to advertise the human race at its best. A poster for San Francisco's exposition showed the manly figure of Hercules splitting apart the American continent. They commissioned huge murals that are the most bizarre examples of the historical symbolism we saw little of at San Diego. In Atlantic and Pacific, the embodiment of labor joins the hands of the two oceans. On the right are the people who will benefit from the canal, and on the left are the ones who came before, allegories of the miner, prospector, engineer, and farmer who gather around a prairie wagon. An Indian sinks into the ocean. In another, Gateway of All Nations, purpose goes through the canal encouraged by fame towards representations of technology. Some other notable exhibits were those brought in from the Philippines, at this time a colony of the United States, that showed the benefits colonialism brought to the Filipinos. Those exhibits were so popular that they were later shipped to San Diego. The San Francisco Exposition was a showcase of all the contradictions that kept the exploitative world of the 19th century running. It was a world where technology only brings about new marvels and the poor are unseen, where we can have peace and international cooperation, and where imperialism is good both for the conquerors and the conquered. But even at this event, the end of their blissful ignorance was on the way. Protesters caused the event to rename the Hawaiian Village exhibit to Hula Dancers. Not much better? And also to close the opium den in underground China. Okay, that one's pretty bad. The native villages also weren't much appreciated this time. Many Americans chose to come to these expositions instead of more traditional travel destinations in Europe to avoid the war. They literally visited a fantasy version of their own society so they could avoid the worst consequence of their actual society. But people were increasingly realizing that there wasn't anything romantic about their world, no matter how many flashing lights you showed them at World's Fairs. It's no surprise these were the last expositions of their kind. Both of the World's Fairs were successful for the cities that hosted them. San Francisco's ran for most of 1915 and over 22 million people attended. San Diego's ran for even longer. It ran for 2 years and 3.4 million people attended. San Francisco's exposition was not much more than a brief influx of admissions revenue to an already massive city. But San Diego was brought out of irrelevance. And unlike San Francisco, San Diego's exposition is still bringing benefits today. The city estimates Balboa Park gets over 14 million visitors per year. And about the events themselves, the dual expositions really were the last of their kind. The next ones were noticeably different, trading art styles that look towards the past for ones that look towards the future. Always representative of their times, the 1915 expositions signaled the ending of an era.